The crack of knuckles against delicate skin echoed through the dusty street of Idaho City, and Wyatt Porter saw the woman's head snap sideways from the force of the blow before her knees buckled beneath her pale yellow dress. He had been leading his pack mule toward the general store, his mind occupied with the supplies he needed for another month in the mountains, when the sound froze him mid-step. His eyes found the scene immediately. A well-dressed man in a fine suit stood over a young woman who had collapsed onto the wooden boardwalk, his hand still raised as if preparing to strike again. The woman's auburn hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, spilling across her shoulders as she pressed one trembling hand to her reddening cheek. "You will learn your place, Josephine," the man hissed, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Eastern money. "When I tell you something, you do not question me. You certainly do not contradict me in public." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He had spent the last 8 years in these mountains, trapping beaver and hunting elk, living a solitary existence that kept him far from the complications of civilized society. He had come into town only because his coffee had run out and his boots needed repair. He had not planned on getting involved in anyone's business, but his feet were already moving, carrying his 6'4" frame across the rutted street with purposeful strides that made his weathered buckskin clothing whisper against his muscled form. "That's enough," Wyatt said, his voice low and steady as he stepped onto the boardwalk. The well-dressed man turned, his pale face flushing with indignation. He was perhaps 30 years old, with carefully groomed dark hair and a thin mustache that looked as though he spent considerable time maintaining it. His eyes narrowed as they traveled over Wyatt's appearance, taking in the long brown hair that brushed past his shoulders, the full beard, the sun-darkened skin, and the powerful build that made the smaller man take an involuntary step backward. "This is none of your concern, mountain man," the suited man said, attempting to inject authority into his voice. "This woman is my fiancé, and I will discipline her as I see fit." Wyatt looked down at the woman called Josephine. She had pushed herself into a sitting position, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and humiliation. A purple bruise was already forming along her cheekbone, stark against her fair skin. She could not have been more than 22 or 23 years old, he estimated, with delicate features that spoke of a genteel upbringing. Her dress, though now dusty from the boardwalk, was made of quality fabric that matched the fine leather of her button-up boots. "No man has the right to strike a woman," Wyatt said, returning his gaze to the fiancé. "Not for any reason." "How dare you presume to tell me what I can and cannot do?" the man sputtered, his face growing redder. "Do you know who I am?" "I'm Charles Sutherland. My father owns half the mining operations in this territory. I could have you run out of these mountains with a single word to the territorial governor." Wyatt felt a familiar coldness settle over him, the same calm that had kept him alive during harsh winters and dangerous encounters with predators, both animal and human. He moved forward slowly, placing himself directly between Charles Sutherland and Josephine. "Then you best use that word quickly, because this woman is not getting struck again while I am standing here." Charles's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, but Wyatt was faster. His own hand shot out and gripped Charles's wrist with crushing strength, stopping the movement before the weapon could clear its holster. Charles gasped in pain, his fingers going slack. "Do not make that mistake," Wyatt said quietly, releasing the wrist with enough force to send Charles stumbling backward. "Walk away." A crowd had begun to gather on both sides of the street, townspeople drawn by the confrontation. Wyatt could hear their whispered conversations, could feel their stares. He recognized a few faces from previous visits to town, but most were strangers. Idaho City had grown considerably in recent years, the gold rush of the early 60s bringing thousands of prospectors and the businesses that followed them. Charles rubbed his wrist, his expression twisted with rage and humiliation. "This is not over. Josephine, get up this instant. We are leaving." Wyatt did not move from his position. Behind him, he heard the rustle of fabric as Josephine climbed to her feet. He half expected her to obey her fiancé's command, to return to the man who had just struck her. It was the year 1876, and women had few choices when it came to their futures, especially women who had already accepted a man's proposal. But Josephine's voice, when it came, was steady despite the slight tremor that ran through it. "No." The single word hung in the dusty air. Charles's mouth fell open. "What did you say?" "I said no." Josephine moved to stand beside Wyatt, though she kept a careful distance. "I will not marry you, Charles. I will not spend my life with a man who strikes me when I displease him." "You have no choice," Charles said, his voice rising. "Your father agreed to this arrangement. You have nowhere else to go. Your family's debts will crush them without my father's money." Wyatt saw Josephine flinch at those words, saw the way her hands clenched in the fabric of her skirt. He made a decision that would change both their lives, though he did not fully realize it in that moment. "She is coming with me," Wyatt said. The words surprised even himself, but once spoken, he did not take them back. Josephine turned to stare at him, her green eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he was serious or mad or both. "You cannot possibly," Charles began, but Wyatt cut him off. "I can and I am. This woman is under my protection now. If you or anyone else tries to follow us or harm her, you will answer to me." He turned slightly toward Josephine. "If you want to come, that is. I will not force you, but I can take you somewhere safe, somewhere far from here." Josephine looked between Wyatt and Charles, and Wyatt could see the war being fought behind her eyes. She was weighing her options, calculating risks and consequences. Her entire future hung in the balance of this single decision. "I do not even know your name," she said to Wyatt, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wyatt Porter, madam." "And where would you take me?" "I have a cabin in the mountains about 3 days' ride from here. It is remote, but it is secure and well stocked. You would be safe there while you figure out what you want to do next." Charles let out a bark of harsh laughter. "You would go into the wilderness with a complete stranger? A savage mountain man who probably has not bathed in months? You would throw away your reputation, your family's future. For what? Freedom?" He spat the last word as if it were poison. Josephine's hand moved to touch the bruise on her face, and Wyatt saw her expression harden. "Yes," she said. "I would." She turned to Wyatt and nodded once firmly. "I will go with you, Mr. Porter. Thank you for your protection." Wyatt felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that he could not quite name. He had lived alone for so long, had grown accustomed to silence and solitude. The idea of bringing another person into his carefully ordered existence should have filled him with reluctance. Instead, he felt only a fierce determination to keep this woman safe. "We need to move quickly," he said. "Gather whatever belongings you have that you can carry." Josephine looked down at herself. "Everything I own is at the hotel where Charles and I were staying, but I do not think going there would be wise." Wyatt nodded. "We will get you what you need along the way. First, we need to get out of town." Charles moved forward, his hand outstretched. "Josephine, do not be foolish. Come back with me. I will forgive this tantrum. We will say nothing more about it." "Stay back," Wyatt warned, and something in his tone made Charles freeze. "Miss Sinclair has made her choice clear." "Her name is Sutherland," Charles said viciously, "or it will be in 2 weeks when we were supposed to marry. And when my father hears about this, he will make sure that Savage pays dearly for his interference." Wyatt ignored the threat. He had heard plenty of threats before, and precious few had amounted to anything. He gathered the rope attached to his pack mule and held out his other hand to Josephine. She hesitated only a moment before placing her smaller hand in his. Her fingers were cold despite the warm June afternoon, and he could feel them trembling. They walked together toward his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding that stood patiently where Wyatt had ground-tied him. The crowd parted before them, faces showing everything from approval to shock to disapproval. Wyatt helped Josephine mount the horse, then swung up behind her. He would walk later and let her ride alone, but for now they needed distance and speed. "This is kidnapping," Charles shouted behind them. "I will have the law after you. Sheriff Morrison will hunt you down." Wyatt turned the horse and looked back at Charles one last time. "She came willingly. Everyone here saw that. You are free to tell the sheriff whatever story you like, but the truth is plain enough." He urged the horse into a trot, the mule following behind on its lead rope. As they moved down the main street toward the edge of town, Wyatt could feel Josephine's body rigid with tension in front of him. She held herself carefully, trying not to lean back against his chest despite the awkwardness of the position. "You can relax," he said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I know you have no reason to trust me yet, but I give you my word that I mean you no harm." I will not touch you inappropriately or force myself on you in any way. I'm simply trying to help." Josephine let out a shaky breath. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help a complete stranger? You have put yourself at risk for someone you do not even know." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, guiding the horse around a wagon that had stopped in the middle of the street. "My mother was married to a man who struck her," he finally said. "I was too young to protect her then. I am not too young anymore." He felt Josephine's body shift slightly, leaning back just a fraction of an inch. It was a gesture of trust, however small, and he found it mattered to him more than he would have expected. They rode in silence through the outskirts of Idaho City, past the smaller cabins and tents that housed the miners and prospectors who continued to work the creeks and hillsides, despite the best claims being long since staked. The town had boomed in the early 1860s when gold was discovered, and though the easy pickings were gone, enough wealth remained in the ground to keep thousands of people scratching at the earth. Once they were beyond the last of the outlying buildings, Wyatt steered the horse onto a narrow trail that led up into the mountains. The path was barely wide enough for a single horse, winding between pine trees and over rocky outcroppings. Behind them, Idaho City gradually disappeared from view, hidden by the rise and fall of the landscape. After about an hour of steady climbing, Wyatt found a small clearing beside a creek and brought the horse to a stop. He dismounted first, then helped Josephine down. She swayed slightly when her feet touched the ground, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "We will rest here for a bit," he said. "Let the animals drink and give you a chance to catch your breath." Josephine nodded, her face pale beneath the darkening bruise. Now that they had stopped moving, the full weight of what she had done seemed to be settling on her shoulders. She walked to a fallen log and sat down heavily, staring at her hands. Wyatt led the horse and mule to the creek, letting them drink their fill while he kept one eye on Josephine. She had not cried yet, had not broken down, and he wondered if she was the type to hold her emotions inside until they exploded, or if she was simply too shocked to fully process everything that had happened. When the animals had drunk their fill, he tied them to a nearby tree where they could graze on the meadow grass. He pulled his canteen from the saddle and walked over to Josephine, offering it to her. "Thank you," she said quietly, accepting the canteen and taking a small sip. "I apologize. I should have asked before drinking from your water." "No need to apologize for basic necessities," Wyatt said. He sat down on the log beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "How is your face?" Josephine touched her cheek gingerly. "It hurts, but I have endured worse." The word sent a surge of anger through Wyatt. "He has struck you before." She nodded slowly. "Not often, usually only when we were alone and I said something that displeased him. He is very concerned with appearances, with maintaining his family's reputation. Today I made the mistake of contradicting him about a business matter in front of some of his father's associates. I suggested that expanding the mining operation into a particular area might be dangerous for the workers because of unstable ground conditions. Charles said I had no understanding of such matters and should keep my opinions to myself. I insisted that I did understand, that I had read extensively about mining techniques and safety concerns." She let out a bitter laugh. "That was my crime, having an opinion and refusing to pretend otherwise." Wyatt listened, his jaw tight. "You should never have had to endure any of it. A man who strikes a woman is no man at all." "My father said much the same thing when he learned about the first incident," Josephine said. "But then Charles's father offered to forgive my family's debts and invest in my father's failing business. Suddenly, my father became very interested in making sure the engagement proceeded smoothly. He told me that all husbands discipline their wives occasionally, that I simply needed to learn how to be more agreeable, more compliant." "Your father was wrong." "Perhaps." Josephine took another sip of water and handed the canteen back to Wyatt. "But it does not change my situation. Charles was right about one thing. Without his family's money, my father will be ruined. My younger sister will have no prospects for a decent marriage. My mother will lose the only home she has ever known. And I have just thrown all of that away because I could not tolerate being struck one more time." Wyatt studied her profile, noting the proud set of her jaw despite the tears that now gathered in her eyes. "You threw away a life of being struck and controlled and diminished. That seems like a fair trade to me." "You do not understand," Josephine said, finally turning to look at him. "I've been raised my entire life to understand that a woman's duty is to marry well, to support her husband, to maintain his household and bear his children. I was educated in the things that would make me an attractive wife: music, embroidery, basic household management. I can plan a dinner party for 20 guests and ensure every detail is perfect. I can discuss literature and art enough to entertain visitors without being too opinionated. I can keep accounts and manage servants. But I cannot survive alone. I have no skills that would allow me to support myself. I have no money of my own. I have nowhere to go except back to my father's house, and he will simply force me to marry Charles anyway, or someone like him." Wyatt waited until she finished speaking before responding. "Then you stay with me until we figure out another option. I told you that you are under my protection. I meant it. However long it takes for you to decide what you want to do with your life, you will have a safe place to stay." "But why would you do this?" Josephine asked, and the question held genuine confusion. "What do you gain from taking in a stranger who brings nothing but trouble with her?" Wyatt considered the question. What did he gain? The answer should have been nothing. He gained complications and risk and the disruption of the peaceful solitary life he had built. But when he looked at Josephine, at the fear and hope warring in her green eyes, he knew he could not have made any other choice. "Maybe I am tired of being alone," he said finally. "Or maybe I just could not walk away from someone who needed help. Does the reason matter so much?" "I suppose not," Josephine said quietly. She looked down at her dusty dress, at the fine fabric now stained and torn at the hem. "I must look a sight." "You look like someone who just made the hardest decision of her life," Wyatt said. "That takes courage." They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the creek babble over its rocky bed and the breeze whisper through the pine trees. Finally, Wyatt stood and offered Josephine his hand. "We should keep moving. I want to put as much distance between us and Idaho City as possible before nightfall. Can you walk for a while? It will be easier on the horse if we both walk when the trail is not too steep." Josephine accepted his hand and stood. "I can walk. These boots are not ideal for hiking, but they will suffice." They continued up into the mountains, following trails that grew increasingly faint and difficult to follow. Wyatt navigated by instinct and memory, leading them through passes and along ridgelines that offered stunning views of the valleys below. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Josephine walked behind Wyatt, leading the horse while he broke trail and ensured the path was safe. He glanced back at her frequently, checking to make sure she was managing the pace. Her face was set in determined lines, and though he could see she was tiring, she never complained or asked to rest. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Wyatt found a suitable spot to make camp. It was a small meadow surrounded by trees, with a natural windbreak formed by large boulders on one side and the creek running along the other edge. "We will stop here for the night," Wyatt announced, leading the animals to the creek. Josephine sank down onto the grass with a small sigh of relief, pulling off her boots to reveal stockings with holes worn through at the heels. Her feet were clearly blistered, though she had not mentioned it during the hours of walking. Wyatt unsaddled the horse and unloaded the supplies from the mule, his movements efficient from years of practice. He set up a small camp with practiced ease, building a fire ring with stones from the creek and gathering deadfall wood for fuel. Within 20 minutes, he had a fire burning and coffee water heating in a small pot. "I have some dried venison and hardtack," he said, pulling the food from his pack. "It is not fancy, but it will keep you going." Josephine accepted the food with murmured thanks. She nibbled at the hardtack, clearly finding it nearly inedible, but she ate the venison without complaint. Wyatt poured coffee when it was ready, handing her a tin cup. "I apologize for the rough accommodations," he said. "I am not set up for guests." "You are apologizing for saving my life and offering me shelter?" Josephine said with a slight smile. "I assure you, Mr. Porter, I am grateful for whatever you can provide." "Wyatt," he said. "You can call me Wyatt. Mr. Porter sounds too formal for people sharing a campfire in the middle of the wilderness." "Then you must call me Josephine." She sipped the coffee and made a face at its bitterness, but she drank it anyway. As darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead in brilliant profusion, Wyatt pulled his bedroll from the pack and laid it out near the fire. Josephine watched him, and he saw uncertainty cross her face. "You will sleep here," he said, gesturing to the bedroll. "I will sleep over there." He pointed to a spot on the opposite side of the fire. "I have extra blankets you can use. It gets cold at night in the mountains, even in summer." "But where will you sleep if I take your bedroll?" Josephine asked. "I have slept on the ground more times than I can count. I will be fine." He could see she wanted to protest, but exhaustion was written clearly on her face. "Please, take it. You need rest." Josephine nodded and moved to the bedroll, settling herself onto it with visible relief. Wyatt draped 2 thick blankets over her, then moved to his own spot and wrapped himself in a bear hide he used for particularly cold nights. "Wyatt," Josephine's voice came quietly across the fire. "Yes?" "Thank you. For everything. I know I have said it already, but I want you to know that I truly am grateful. You did not have to involve yourself in my troubles." "Get some sleep, Josephine. We have a long day of traveling tomorrow." He heard her shift in the bedroll, getting comfortable. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. Wyatt lay awake longer, staring up at the stars and wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. He had always been a loner, content with his own company and the company of the animals he hunted and trapped. The idea of being responsible for another person, especially a woman from a completely different world, should have terrified him. But it did not. Instead, he felt a sense of rightness that he could not explain, as if some missing piece of his life had suddenly fallen into place. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the grass despite it being June. Wyatt rose before the sun, rekindling the fire and putting on coffee. He had shot a rabbit the evening before with a single arrow, too quiet to disturb Josephine's sleep, and he now roasted it over the flames. Josephine woke to the smell of cooking meat. She sat up slowly, wincing as her body protested the hard sleeping conditions. Her hair had come completely free of its pins during the night and tumbled around her shoulders in auburn waves that caught the morning light. "Good morning," Wyatt said, not looking directly at her. He had a feeling she would be self-conscious about her disheveled appearance. "There is fresh water in the creek if you want to wash up. I will keep my back turned to give you privacy." "Thank you," Josephine said. She stood and made her way to the creek, and Wyatt heard the splash of water as she washed her face and hands. When she returned, he handed her a portion of the rabbit on a flat piece of bark that served as a plate. They ate in companionable silence, the morning birds beginning their songs in the trees around them. "How much farther to your cabin?" Josephine asked as they prepared to break camp. "If we make good time, we should arrive by tomorrow evening. The trail gets rougher from here, though, and steeper." Josephine nodded, pulling on her boots despite the obvious pain it caused her blistered feet. Wyatt noticed and went to his pack, pulling out a small tin. "This is a salve I make from bear fat and herbs," he said, offering it to her. "It will help with those blisters. Put it on now before we start walking." Josephine looked surprised but accepted the tin. She sat down and removed her boots and stockings, revealing angry red blisters on both heels and several toes. Wyatt looked away while she applied the salve, giving her privacy. They traveled through the morning and into the afternoon, climbing higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner and cooler, and the vegetation changed from mixed forest to primarily pine and spruce. They saw elk in the distance, a small herd grazing in a meadow, and once Wyatt stopped them both, placing a finger to his lips as a bear and 2 cubs crossed the trail about 50 yards ahead. Josephine's eyes went wide with fear, but she remained silent and still until the bears had disappeared into the trees. Only then did she let out a shaky breath. "Are there many bears here?" she asked in a whisper, as if the animals might still hear her. "Plenty," Wyatt said. "Black bears mostly, though there are grizzlies higher up. As long as you do not surprise them or get between a mother and her cubs, they usually leave people alone." "Usually," Josephine repeated faintly. Wyatt allowed himself a small smile. "I will keep you safe from the bears." They made camp that evening beside a small alpine lake, its surface reflecting the surrounding peaks like polished glass. Josephine stood at the water's edge, staring out at the view with an expression of wonder. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "I have never seen anything like this." Wyatt joined her at the water's edge, seeing the landscape through her eyes. He had spent so many years in these mountains that he sometimes forgot how spectacular they could be to someone experiencing them for the first time. "The mountains are honest," he said. "They do not pretend to be something they are not. They do not lie or manipulate. They just exist, following their own nature. I've always found that comforting." Josephine turned to look at him, her green eyes thoughtful. "Is that why you came here? To escape the lies and manipulations of civilized society?" "Partially," Wyatt admitted. "I also came because I needed space to breathe, to think, to figure out who I was without everyone telling me who I should be." "And did you? Figure out who you are?" Wyatt considered the question. "I think so, or at least I figured out who I'm not." "That is something." They prepared another simple meal and ate while watching the sunset over the lake, the water turning golden and then purple as the light faded. Josephine seemed more comfortable tonight, less uncertain of her place in this wild environment. She asked Wyatt questions about the mountains, about the animals and plants and weather patterns, and he answered them patiently, surprised by her genuine interest. "You know a great deal about this land," Josephine observed. "How long have you lived here?" 8 years, Wyatt said. "I came in '68 when I was 19 years old. I'd been working as a ranch hand down in the territory, but I got tired of taking orders and sleeping in a bunkhouse with 20 other men. A trapper I met told me about these mountains, about the good beaver trapping and the solitude. So I saved every penny I earned for a year, bought my supplies and my rifle, and headed up here." "You were so young," Josephine said. "Were you not frightened?" "Terrified," Wyatt admitted with a rare grin. "That first winter I nearly froze to death twice and almost starved once. But I learned. The mountains are harsh teachers, but they are thorough." "And in all that time you have lived alone?" "Mostly. I come down to Idaho City or one of the other settlements a few times a year to trade my furs and buy supplies. Sometimes I run into other trappers or prospectors, but yes, mostly alone." Josephine was quiet for a moment. "That sounds very lonely." Wyatt shrugged. "It is peaceful. Or it was." He caught himself and added quickly, "I did not mean that as a complaint. I am glad you are here. I just meant that my life has been very different from yours." "My life," Josephine said with a trace of bitterness, "has been a series of carefully constructed prisons. First my parents' house, where I was taught to be a proper young lady. Then finishing school, where I learned to be an ornament for a wealthy man's drawing room. And finally Charles's gilded cage, where I was expected to be grateful for my good fortune in attracting such an advantageous match." She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. "I have never been free. Not for a single day of my life. I have never made a real decision about what I wanted or where I wanted to go or who I wanted to be." "You made a decision yesterday," Wyatt pointed out. "A real one." "And look where it has brought me," Josephine said, gesturing at the wilderness around them. "I have traded one form of dependence for another. I am relying on your charity, your protection, your knowledge of how to survive in this place. I am still not free. I am just dependent on a different man." Wyatt understood her frustration, but he shook his head. "That's not the same thing at all. You can leave any time you want. I am not keeping you here, and while you are here, I will teach you what I know, how to identify edible plants, how to start a fire, how to find water and shelter. You do not have to remain dependent if you do not want to." Josephine looked at him with surprise. "You would teach me those things?" "Why would I not? Knowledge is the only real power we have in this world. Seems foolish to keep it to myself." A slow smile spread across Josephine's face, the first genuine smile Wyatt had seen from her. It transformed her features, making her look younger and lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Then yes," she said, "I would very much like to learn." They reached Wyatt's cabin the following evening, just as the last light was fading from the sky. The structure sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, built against a rocky outcropping that provided natural protection from the wind. It was larger than Josephine had expected, constructed from heavy logs with careful chinking between them and a solid roof made of split wood shingles. Wyatt opened the heavy wooden door and gestured for Josephine to enter first. She stepped inside and found herself in a single large room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, built with the same skill and attention to detail as the rest of the cabin. Rough shelves held supplies and equipment, everything organized with military precision. A large bed frame crafted from pine logs stood in one corner, covered with thick furs and woven blankets. A sturdy table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and various pelts hung from the rafters to cure. "It is not much," Wyatt said, following her inside, "but it stays warm in winter and cool in summer. The water from the creek behind the cabin is clean and cold year-round." "It is wonderful," Josephine said honestly. The cabin was rough by the standards of her upbringing, but it radiated a sense of competence and care. Everything had its place. Every item served a purpose. "You built this yourself?" "Over the course of my first year here," Wyatt confirmed. He moved to the fireplace and began building a fire with practiced motions. "It started as a much smaller structure, but I've expanded it over time. Added the stone fireplace 3 years ago. Before that, I just had a fire pit in the center of the room and a smoke hole in the roof." Josephine walked slowly around the space, examining everything with curiosity. She paused at the bookshelf, surprised to find a collection of perhaps 20 volumes. She pulled one out and found it was a collection of Shakespeare's plays. "You read?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Wyatt looked up from the fire, and she caught a flash of something that might have been hurt in his eyes before his expression smoothed back into neutral calm. "Just because I live in the mountains does not mean I'm illiterate. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She made sure I could read and write and do figures before I was 10 years old." "I apologize," Josephine said quickly, feeling her face heat with embarrassment. "I did not mean to imply anything insulting. I am just surprised and pleased. I love to read, and I was worried I would have nothing to occupy my mind here." The tension left Wyatt's shoulders. "You are welcome to read anything on those shelves. I add to the collection whenever I'm in town and find something interesting." The fire caught and began to warm the cabin, pushing back the evening chill. Wyatt showed Josephine where everything was kept, the food stores, the extra blankets, the basin for washing. Then he stood awkwardly in the center of the room, and Josephine realized he was trying to figure out the sleeping arrangements. "You will take the bed," he said finally. "I can sleep on the floor near the fire." "Absolutely not," Josephine protested. "This is your home. I will not displace you from your own bed. I can sleep on the floor. You are a guest and a woman. You get the bed. I am an uninvited guest who has disrupted your entire life. The least I can do is sleep on the floor." They stared at each other for a moment, and then Wyatt let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "You are stubborn. So are you, apparently." "Fine," Wyatt said. "The bed is large enough for 2 people if we divide it down the middle. I will sleep on one side, you on the other, with blankets separating us. That way neither of us has to sleep on the floor." Josephine felt her face heat again, but she had to admit it was a practical solution. "Very well, but you must promise to respect the boundary." "I already gave you my word about that," Wyatt said quietly. "I do not give my word lightly, and I do not break it." That night they lay in the same bed for the first time, a thick bear hide serving as a barrier between them. Josephine stared up at the ceiling, acutely aware of Wyatt's presence just a few feet away. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady, and smell the masculine scent of leather and pine and wood smoke that clung to him. "Wyatt," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes?" "What will happen if Charles sends people to find me, if they come here?" She felt more than saw Wyatt shift in the bed. "Then I will deal with them. You are safe here, Josephine. I promise you that." His words, spoken with such quiet certainty, eased the anxiety that had been coiling in her chest. She closed her eyes and let herself relax into the soft furs beneath her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." This time, Wyatt did not respond, and Josephine thought perhaps he had fallen asleep. But just as she was drifting off herself, she heard his voice, low and rough in the darkness. "You are welcome." The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Wyatt was true to his word about teaching Josephine wilderness skills. Each morning they would go for walks in the forest surrounding the cabin, and he would point out edible plants and show her how to identify them. She learned to recognize wild onions and cattail roots, huckleberries and service berries, miner's lettuce and dandelion greens. He taught her how to build different types of fires, how to identify dry wood that would burn without smoking, how to use flint and steel when matches were not available. He showed her how to set snares for rabbits and how to track deer by reading their prints in the soft earth. Josephine proved to be an eager and quick student. She asked thoughtful questions and remembered everything Wyatt told her. She was not afraid to get her hands dirty or to struggle with a task until she mastered it. The fine lady in the yellow dress gradually disappeared, replaced by a woman in borrowed buckskin pants and one of Wyatt's shirts, her auburn hair braided back in a practical plait. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and read aloud to each other, taking turns with the books from Wyatt's collection. Josephine had a gift for reading dialogue, giving each character a distinct voice that brought the stories to life. Wyatt found himself looking forward to these evening reading sessions as much as he looked forward to anything. They talked as well, long conversations that ranged from philosophy to politics to personal histories. Josephine told him about growing up in a wealthy San Francisco household, about her mother's obsession with social standing and her father's increasingly desperate business dealings. She spoke of her younger sister Margaret, only 16 and sweet-natured, who would now bear the consequences of Josephine's broken engagement. Wyatt shared pieces of his own past that he had never told anyone. He spoke of his father, a violent drunk who had terrorized his mother and sisters until Wyatt was big enough to fight back. He told her about the night he had finally stood up to his father, how they had fought in the yard while his mother and sisters screamed. His father had left that night and never returned, and Wyatt had stayed long enough to see his mother and sisters settled safely before striking out on his own. "You were protecting them, just like you protected me," Josephine said when he finished the story. "Maybe that's all I know how to do," Wyatt said with a shrug. "Protect people. That's not a bad thing to know how to do." As June turned into July, something began to shift between them. The careful distance they had maintained started to feel less like safety and more like deprivation. Josephine found herself noticing things about Wyatt that had nothing to do with survival skills. The way his muscles moved beneath his shirt when he was chopping wood. The rare smile that softened his hard features. The gentleness in his rough hands when he was showing her how to identify a plant or tie a knot. Wyatt, for his part, became increasingly aware of Josephine as a woman rather than simply someone under his protection. He noticed the curve of her neck when she bent over her task, the sound of her laughter, which came more frequently as she grew more comfortable, the intelligence in her eyes when they debated some point of literature or philosophy. The barrier of furs between them in the bed began to feel like a cruelty, keeping them apart when every other part of their lives had become intertwined. One evening in mid-July, they were cleaning up after dinner when Josephine's hand brushed against Wyatt's as they both reached for the same dish. The contact was brief, barely a touch, but it sent electricity racing through both of them. They froze, hands suspended in midair, eyes locked. "Josephine," Wyatt said, his voice rough, "I need you to know that if you want to leave, if you want me to take you back to civilization, I will do it. You do not owe me anything." "I know that," Josephine said softly. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" "No," Wyatt admitted. "But what I want does not matter. You should not be here with me. You should be in San Francisco attending parties and meeting men who can give you the kind of life you deserve, not stuck in a cabin in the middle of the wilderness with a mountain man who barely qualifies as civilized." Josephine set down the dish she had been holding and turned to face Wyatt fully. "What if the life I deserve is the one I choose for myself? What if I am happier here in this cabin, learning to survive in the wilderness and reading Shakespeare by firelight than I ever was in my parents' mansion or at Charles's side?" "You have only been here a month," Wyatt said. "Wait until winter comes and you are trapped inside this cabin for weeks at a time. Wait until you cannot bathe properly for months and your hands are chapped and bleeding from the cold. Wait until you are so desperate for female company or a decent dress or a real bed that you cannot stand it anymore." "Or wait until I realize that this is exactly where I want to be," Josephine countered. She took a step closer to him, near enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Wait until I am certain that the man who saved me from a life of misery is also the man I am falling in love with." The words hung between them, impossible to take back. Wyatt stared down at Josephine, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the fear and hope mingled in her expression, could see that it had taken all her courage to speak those words. "You do not know what you are saying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, I do," Josephine said. "I am saying that somewhere between Idaho City and this cabin, between learning to build fires and reading poetry together, I started to fall in love with you. And I think you might feel the same way, but you are too honorable to say anything because you think I am vulnerable or confused or just grateful for your help." Wyatt reached up and cupped her cheek in his large hand, his thumb brushing gently across the spot where Charles's blow had left a fading bruise. "You are all of those things, and you deserve better than a rough mountain man who has nothing to offer you but a hard life and a lonely cabin." "You are offering me freedom," Josephine said, leaning into his touch. "You are offering me respect and kindness and the chance to become whoever I want to be. How is that not everything?" Wyatt felt something break loose inside his chest, some wall he had built to protect himself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. He bent his head and kissed her, gently at first and then with growing passion as she responded, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. "I fell in love with you the moment I saw you stand up and tell Charles you would not marry him," he admitted. "I have been trying to convince myself it was not real, that it was just my protective instincts or loneliness or 100 other things, but it is none of those. It is just you, Josephine. You are brilliant and brave and stubborn, and I love you for all of it." Josephine smiled, her eyes bright with tears. "Then stop trying to send me away and let me stay. Let me build a life here with you if that is what we both want." "It is what I want more than anything," Wyatt said. "But I need you to be sure, really sure. Because once you commit to this life, once winter comes and the passes are snowed in, you cannot change your mind. You will be stuck here with me until spring." "Good," Josephine said and kissed him again. That night they removed the barrier of furs between them and slept in each other's arms for the first time. Wyatt held Josephine close, marveling at the feel of her soft curves against his hard body, at the trust she showed by letting herself be so vulnerable with him. They did not make love that night, both of them wanting to take their time, to build toward that moment rather than rushing into it. But they talked deep into the night, making plans and sharing dreams. Josephine spoke of teaching Wyatt to play chess, which she'd been quite good at before her father decided such intellectual pursuits were unladylike. Wyatt talked about teaching her to shoot, to hunt, to trap. They discussed building additions to the cabin, perhaps a separate space for storing food and a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings. As Josephine finally drifted off to sleep in his arms, Wyatt stared up at the ceiling and felt something he had not experienced in years: contentment. Not just the satisfaction of a successful hunt or a job well done, but deep, soul-level contentment. The sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly who he was supposed to be with. The summer passed in a golden haze of work and learning and growing love. Josephine became increasingly skilled at wilderness survival, able to set snares and start fires and identify plants without Wyatt's help. She learned to shoot with Wyatt's rifle, practicing until she could hit a target at 50 yards more often than not. She also began putting her own stamp on the cabin, organizing things in ways that made more sense to her, creating storage solutions for the various herbs and plants they harvested. She used sinew and leather to repair Wyatt's worn clothes and made curtains for the windows from spare fabric she found among his trading goods. Wyatt, in turn, found himself becoming more civilized under Josephine's influence. She insisted on proper table manners during meals, on using soap regularly rather than just when he felt particularly dirty, on maintaining the cabin in good order. He grumbled about these changes, but secretly appreciated them. The cabin had always been functional, but under Josephine's care, it became a home. In August, they made love for the first time, a coming together that felt both inevitable and precious. Wyatt was gentle and patient, aware that despite her engagement to Charles, Josephine had never been with a man before. He took his time, showing her pleasure before seeking his own, making sure she felt safe and cherished throughout. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the furs, Josephine traced the scars that marked Wyatt's chest and arms. "Tell me about these," she said. He identified each one for her. A knife fight with a drunk miner when he was 20. A close call with a bear's claws during his second winter. A bullet grazed from a thief who had tried to steal his pelts. The story behind each scar was a testimony to how hard he had fought to survive in this harsh land. "You have been through so much," Josephine said softly. "You are so strong." "Strength is not just about surviving," Wyatt said, running his fingers through her hair. "You are strong, too. Strong enough to walk away from everything you knew to build a new life. Strong enough to adapt to circumstances that would break most people. Strong enough to take a chance on a mountain man who had nothing to offer but his heart." "Your heart is everything," Josephine said, and kissed him again. As autumn approached and the leaves began to turn gold and red, Wyatt and Josephine made trips down the mountain to gather supplies for winter. They did not return to Idaho City, both of them wary of running into Charles or anyone from his father's mining operation. Instead, they traveled to a smaller settlement called Warren, 2 days' ride to the northeast. Warren was even more remote than Idaho City, a rough mining camp that clung to existence through pure stubbornness. The miners and traders there asked few questions and cared little about other people's business. Wyatt traded some of his furs for flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples they would need to get through the winter. He also traded for fabric, needles, and thread, so Josephine could make herself proper winter clothes. On their second trip to Warren in October, they ran into a circuit preacher who traveled through the remote settlements performing marriages, baptisms, and funerals. Josephine and Wyatt looked at each other, and without needing to speak, they both knew what they wanted. The preacher married them in the back room of a trading post, with the proprietor and his wife as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, nothing like the elaborate wedding that would have joined Josephine to Charles. But when Wyatt slid a ring made from twisted gold wire onto her finger and promised to love and protect her until death separated them, Josephine felt more married than any fancy ceremony in a church could have made her. They rode back to the cabin as husband and wife, and that night they celebrated their marriage in the privacy of their home, making love with the knowledge that they were now bound together in every way that mattered. Winter came early that year, with the first major snowfall arriving in mid-November. Wyatt had spent weeks preparing, chopping enough wood to fill the entire side of the cabin and hunting constantly to build up their supply of dried and smoked meat. He brought down 2 elk and a deer, and Josephine helped him preserve every scrap of meat and tan the hides for use through the winter. When the snows finally closed the passes and trapped them in the cabin, Josephine discovered that Wyatt had been right about one thing. Winter in the mountains was hard. They went weeks without seeing another human being. The cold was brutal, fierce enough that even with the fire burning constantly, frost formed on the inside of the windows. They had to dress in layers of furs and wool just to stay warm. But Wyatt had been wrong about Josephine's reaction to these hardships. Instead of becoming desperate or depressed, she threw herself into making the best of the situation. She taught Wyatt to play chess using pieces she carved from wood. She read aloud for hours, losing herself in stories of distant lands and different times. She experimented with their limited ingredients, finding ways to make the same basic supplies into different meals. Most importantly, she had Wyatt. They talked more during that winter than either of them had talked in their entire lives. They shared every story, every memory, every thought and opinion and dream. They made love frequently, finding in physical intimacy a way to combat the isolation and cold. They laughed together and occasionally argued, learning how to navigate disagreements without damaging the fundamental trust between them. In February, when the winter darkness seemed like it would never end, Josephine realized she had missed her monthly courses twice. She said nothing at first, wanting to be certain, but as the signs became undeniable, she knew she had to tell Wyatt. She waited until after dinner one evening, when they were sitting by the fire with Wyatt working on repairing a pair of snowshoes and Josephine mending a tear in one of his shirts. "Wyatt," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, reading the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you ill?" "No, not ill." She took a deep breath. "I am with child." Wyatt stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, A smile spread across his face, transforming his hard features into something soft and joyful. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor to confirm it." Wyatt set aside the snowshoes and crossed to Josephine, pulling her up from her chair and into his arms. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Josephine asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy?" Wyatt cupped her face in his hands, looking down at her with such love that it made her breath catch. "Josephine, I am more than happy. I am terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted. A home, a wife, and now a child. How could I be anything but happy?" They held each other for a long time, swaying slightly in the firelight. Josephine felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy and relief. She had not been certain how Wyatt would react to the news of a baby, had worried that he might see it as a burden or a complication. But his response proved once again that she had chosen the right man, that the decision she had made on that dusty street in Idaho City had been the best decision of her life. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snows and opening the passes. Wyatt and Josephine emerged from their winter cocoon to find the world reborn in green and gold. Josephine's belly had begun to swell with the growing child, and Wyatt found himself watching her constantly, marveling at the physical proof of their love. In June, exactly 1 year after Josephine had left Idaho City, they made the journey to Warren so Josephine could be near the settlement when her time came. The proprietor's wife, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had birthed 8 children of her own, agreed to help with the delivery. Josephine went into labor on a warm afternoon in late June. The delivery was long and difficult, and there were moments when Wyatt, pacing outside the room, genuinely feared he might lose both his wife and child. But Josephine proved as strong in childbirth as she had been in everything else, and as the sun was setting, Mrs. Henderson emerged with a squalling infant wrapped in soft cloth. "You have a son," she announced with a tired smile, "a big, healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him." Wyatt pushed past her into the room, finding Josephine propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, but her face glowing with exhausted triumph. She held their son against her chest, the baby's cries quieting as he found his mother's warmth. "Look at him," Josephine whispered as Wyatt knelt beside the bed. "Look at what we made." Wyatt stared down at the tiny face, at the miniature hands that waved in the air, and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "You are perfect. I love you so much." They named him William, after Wyatt's maternal grandfather, who had been a kind man in a family that had little kindness. William Porter, born in the wild territory of Idaho to a mountain man and the society woman who had chosen a hard life with him over an easy life without him. They stayed in Warren for 2 weeks, while Josephine recovered her strength, then made the journey back to their cabin. Josephine rode the horse while Wyatt walked beside her, carrying William in a sling against his chest. The baby seemed to enjoy the motion and the warmth of his father's body, sleeping peacefully for most of the trip. Life at the cabin changed with William's arrival, as all lives change with the addition of a child. The nights were interrupted by feedings and crying. The days were structured around the baby's needs, but Wyatt and Josephine adapted, just as they had adapted to everything else their life together had thrown at them. Wyatt proved to be a devoted father, as gentle with William as he had been with Josephine. He carved toys for his son and sang half-remembered lullabies from his own childhood. He would walk William for hours when the baby was fussy, his large hands cradling the tiny body with infinite care. Josephine blossomed in motherhood, her natural intelligence and organizational skills serving her well as she navigated the challenges of caring for an infant in wilderness conditions. She figured out how to fashion diapers from soft cloth and how to keep William warm through the cool mountain nights. She made a cradle from bent willow branches and soft furs that kept the baby safe and comfortable. As William grew from infant to toddler, he proved to be his parents' son in every way. He had Josephine's green eyes and quick mind, and Wyatt's sturdy build and fearless nature. By the time he was 2 years old, he was following Wyatt around the cabin in the clearing, imitating his father's every action. When William was 3, Josephine became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. And this time, when she went into labor in the cabin with only Wyatt to help her, she was calm and focused. Their daughter came into the world on a cold December morning, arriving much faster than William had. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that bloomed around the cabin every summer. She was smaller than William had been, with Wyatt's dark hair and Josephine's delicate features. From the beginning, she was a determined child, nursing vigorously and fixing her parents with an intense stare that suggested she knew exactly what she wanted from life. The years passed, measured not in calendar dates but in the changing seasons and the growth of their children. William grew tall and strong, learning to hunt and trap alongside his father. Rose proved to have her mother's love of reading and her father's skill with practical tasks, equally comfortable with a book or a fishing rod. When William was 10 and Rose was 7, Josephine gave birth to twin boys. The pregnancy had been difficult and the delivery was the hardest yet. For a time, Wyatt genuinely feared he would lose Josephine, watching helplessly as she labored to bring their sons into the world. But once again, her strength prevailed. Thomas and James Porter were born healthy and howling, immediately establishing themselves as a handful, even by the standards of parents who had already raised 2 children. By this time, word of Wyatt and Josephine's family had spread through the scattered settlements of the territory. They were known as the Hermit Porters, the family who lived high in the mountains and rarely came down except for essential supplies. Stories circulated about them, some true and some wildly exaggerated. Some said Josephine was a princess who had fled an arranged marriage. Others claimed Wyatt was a wanted outlaw hiding from the law. The truth was both more simple and more extraordinary than any of the rumors. They were simply 2 people who had found each other when they each needed saving, who had chosen to build a life together on their own terms, and who had created a family in one of the harshest environments imaginable. The children grew up wild and free, educated by their mother's extensive knowledge and their father's wilderness skills. Josephine taught them to read and write and do mathematics. She taught them history and literature and philosophy, using the growing collection of books that Wyatt continued to acquire on his infrequent trips to the settlements. Wyatt taught them to survive in the mountains, to read signs in the forest and weather in the sky, to respect the land and the animals that shared it with them. On one memorable occasion when William was 15, a group of men from Idaho City made their way up to the cabin. Wyatt saw them coming from a distance and prepared for trouble, sending Josephine and the children into the forest to hide. But when the men arrived, they came not with violence, but with a message. Charles Sutherland was dead, killed in a mining accident 3 years prior. His father, broken by grief and bad business decisions, had lost his fortune and died shortly after. The debts that had once forced Josephine into an engagement had been dissolved in bankruptcy proceedings. Her parents had moved back to Boston to live with relatives, and her sister Margaret had married a clerk and seemed content with her modest life. "Thought the lady might want to know she was free," the lead man said, tipping his hat respectfully. "Free to go back to her people if she wanted, I mean." Wyatt thanked them for the information and sent them on their way with some fresh meat for their trouble. When Josephine and the children emerged from the forest, he told her what he had learned. Josephine listened quietly, processing this news from a life that felt like it belonged to a different person. "Do you think I should try to contact my family?" she asked Wyatt that night after the children were asleep. "That's your decision to make," Wyatt said. "I will support whatever you choose." Josephine was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Finally, she said, "I would like to write to my sister, to let her know I am alive and well, but I have no desire to return to that life. This is my home. You and our children are my family. Everything I need is right here." She did write to Margaret, a long letter detailing her life in the mountains and the family she had built. She was honest about the hardships, but also about the profound happiness she had found. Margaret wrote back months later, her letter full of relief and joy at hearing from her sister. They maintained a correspondence over the years, exchanging letters once or twice a year, but they never saw each other again. The distance was too great, and Josephine had no desire to leave her mountain home. As the children grew into adolescence and then adulthood, they each had to make their own choices about their futures. William, at 18, decided he wanted to attend university in the East to learn engineering and perhaps build bridges or railroads. Wyatt and Josephine supported his decision, having saved money from years of trapping and trading, specifically to give their children options they had never had. William left for school with tears in his eyes and promises to return, and he kept those promises. He came back every summer during his school years, and after graduation, he returned permanently, bringing with him a wife he had met in Boston and a head full of ideas about improving life in the Western Territories. He built a house on the edge of the clearing near his parents' cabin and divided his time between designing infrastructure projects for the growing towns and helping his father with the trapping business. Rose, at 20, married a young doctor who had come to Warren to establish a practice. She moved to the settlement but visited her parents frequently, often bringing her husband to consult with Josephine about herbal remedies and wilderness medicine. Rose eventually became a midwife herself, using the knowledge Josephine had acquired through necessity to help other women in the isolated mountain communities. The twins, Thomas and James, were inseparable throughout their childhood and remained so as adults. They took over the trapping business from Wyatt, working together with the kind of unspoken coordination that only twins can achieve. They built their own cabin a few miles from their parents' place, but they ate dinner with Wyatt and Josephine at least twice a week, filling the cabin with their boisterous energy and endless stories of their adventures. As Wyatt and Josephine moved into their 50s, they found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. The children were grown and settled. The hard physical labor of survival could be shared with their sons. They had long since accumulated enough money from their trapping and trading to live comfortably by mountain standards. They spent their days working together in the garden Josephine had cultivated over the years, taking long walks through the forest, and sitting by the fire reading to each other as they had done from the very beginning. Their love had deepened over the decades, weathered by hardship and strengthened by shared experience. "Do you ever regret it?" Wyatt asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "Giving up your old life? Staying here with me?" Josephine turned to look at him, at the silver threaded through his hair and beard, at the lines time had carved into his face. He was still strong and capable, still the man who had stepped between her and violence all those years ago. But more than that, he was her partner, her friend, the father of her children, the love of her life. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This life, this place, this family we built together. This is everything I never knew I wanted. You saved me that day in Idaho City, but not in the way I first thought. You did not just save me from Charles, you saved me from a life where I would never have been truly myself, never have been truly free, never have been truly loved." Wyatt reached over and took her hand, his rough fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "You saved me too," he said. "I was alive before you came, but I was not living. You taught me that surviving was not enough, that I could have more if I was brave enough to reach for it." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky and the stars begin to emerge. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their grandchildren playing near William's house. The family had grown beyond anything either of them had imagined that day in Idaho City when Wyatt had stepped between Josephine and her violent fiancé. As the years continued to pass, Wyatt and Josephine settled into a peaceful old age. They were surrounded by children and grandchildren, their cabin serving as the heart of a small family compound that had grown up around them. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin having children of their own, ensuring that the family they had started would continue for generations. When Wyatt was 73, he fell ill with a fever that would not break. Josephine nursed him with the same fierce determination that had characterized everything she did. But they both knew this was one battle even she could not win for him. On a cold February morning, with Josephine holding his hand and all 4 of their children gathered around his bed, Wyatt Porter took his last breath. Josephine grieved deeply, as one would expect after losing a partner of nearly 50 years. But she did not break under the weight of her grief. She had learned too well the lessons of survival that Wyatt had taught her. She continued living in the cabin they had shared, tending her garden and reading her books and welcoming the constant stream of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who came to visit. She lived another 7 years after Wyatt's death, remaining sharp and capable until the very end. When she finally passed in her sleep one summer night at the age of 79, she was buried beside Wyatt in the clearing behind the cabin under a headstone that read simply, "Josephine Porter, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She chose freedom." The cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations. It was expanded and improved over time, but the original structure that Wyatt had built remained at its heart. The Porter descendants would gather there every summer for a reunion, telling stories of the mountain man who had saved a society woman from a violent fiancé and the life they had built together in the wilderness. The story of Wyatt and Josephine became family legend, embellished and romanticized with each retelling. But at its core, it remained what it had always been, a story of courage and choice, of two people who had found each other when they most needed saving and who had built something beautiful and lasting from the ruins of their former lives. In the little cemetery behind the cabin, the two headstones stood side by side under the towering pines, marking the final resting place of two people who had loved fiercely and lived fully. And in the mountains around them, in the wind through the trees and the rush of the creek and the cry of the eagles overhead, their story lived on, a testament to the enduring power of love freely chosen and courageously pursued. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren would sometimes ask what made their story so special, why Wyatt and Josephine were remembered with such reverence while other ancestors faded into the background of family history. The answer was always the same, because they had shown that it was possible to choose your own path, to build your own life, to find love and happiness on your own terms, regardless of what society expected or demanded. Because in a time and place where women had few choices and men often ruled through violence and fear, Josephine had chosen freedom and Wyatt had honored that choice. Because when it mattered most, Wyatt had stepped between Josephine and danger, and she had trusted him enough to let him take her far from there. And because from that single moment of courage and trust, an entire legacy had been born. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the lives that played out in their shadow. And somewhere in the wind and the stone and the endless sky, the spirits of Wyatt and Josephine Porter remained, forever together in the wild land they had made their home. Their love story, born in violence but forged in trust and mutual respect, had become the foundation upon which generations built their lives. And so, the story ended, not with sadness, but with satisfaction, with the knowledge that two lives well lived had created ripples that would extend far beyond their own years. The cabin still stood, lovingly maintained by their descendants. The clearing still bloomed with wild roses every summer. And the memory of a mountain man who stepped between a woman and her violent fiancé, who took her far from there and gave her the freedom to choose her own destiny, lived on in the hearts of everyone who heard the tale. It was a story of the Wild West in all its harsh beauty, of survival and strength and the transformative power of love. It was a story of two souls who found each other against all odds and built something that would last long after they were gone. It was, quite simply, a story of two people who had loved each other well, who had chosen each other every day for nearly 50 years, and who had created a legacy that would endure for generations to come. And in the end, what more could anyone ask from a life than that?